Hey guys, welcome to the first installment of the METS Mastermind video series. Luke McElroy here from METS Performance Consulting, obviously, and today we're going to go through training to improve VO2 Max, so what you can do to boost up your VO2 Max there. So first of all, we'll define what VO2 Max is. You can read that on the slide there, but your VO2 Max, the definition of it is the maximum volume of oxygen, so the total amount of oxygen that we can breathe in via the lungs, transport by the heart and the cardiovascular system, and absorb by the muscles to create aerobic energy. All right? The reason aerobic energy is good is because we get 18 times more energy than any other energy system that we can use, and we get non-fatiguing metabolic byproducts. So we get heat, water, and carbon dioxide as our byproducts. Heat is fine so long as we can control it through sweating, hydration, fans, that sort of thing. Carbon dioxide is just breathed back into the air, and water is absorbed by the body, so that's all fine. However, when we get to an intensity where we can't get all of our energy from the aerobic system alone, because unfortunately the aerobic system is a slow releasing energy system. It has to undergo a lot of processes to get that energy. So when we get to an intensity where we can't get all of it from the aerobic system alone, then we have to start getting increased contribution from the anaerobic system. Now, the anaerobic system doesn't require oxygen, and as such, it can give us energy very, very quickly. However, it only gives us 1/18 of the total energy that we could have got if we had oxygen available, and we also get lactic acid as our byproduct, which causes a lot of fatigue. Okay, now lactic acid, think of lactic acid, well, it literally is acid. It makes our blood more acidic. It has a hydrogen component in it, and that hydrogen, for anyone who's a bit familiar with chemistry, pH, potential hydrogen of a fluid, is a ranking from, or a scale from 1 to 14, which measures the acidity or the alkalinity of a fluid. So 1 is pure acid, 14 is very, very alkaline, and 7 is neutral. All right, so the pH of the blood is actually 7.35 to 7.45, so a very fine range there. When we get an accumulation of lactic acid and therefore hydrogen, the more acidic the blood becomes, so we get closer towards the 1 end of the scale. And it doesn't take a lot to really put our body under stress. So as soon as we shift out of that 7.35, we go below that because we have lactic acid, our mitochondria start to shut off. And what our mitochondria are, they're in the muscles, and their sole responsibility is to get the oxygen that we've breathed in and circulated, get it from the blood into the muscles to create aerobic energy. Now, when there's lactic acid present, it's not an ideal environment for them. All right? It's like trying to build a fire in the snow. You're going to be able to do it, but it's not going to be nearly as good as if it was in an optimal environment, such as, hot, windy, dry bushland area. So the VO2 max is a key performance indicator for endurance events because the higher the number or the more oxygen that we can use every minute, the longer, harder, faster we can go before we have to start producing lactic acid, which causes fatigue and makes us slow down. All right. So some of the literature, as you can see here, look, it says we can increase our VO2 max 5 to 10% in untrained individuals within sort of 6 weeks. If you guys remember back to the experiment I did with ELISA, we actually improved it by 17% in 4 weeks. So look, it depends what you're doing there. They say increases around 20% after 6 months. Again, I think we can do more than that, particularly 6 months and later. But look, the key take home here is that it is a trainable thing. A lot of people think it's just genetic and you get what you get, but that's not true. We can change it through training. There are responders and non-responders, so there is a small proportion of the population who actually won't respond to endurance training at all. But look, I'd say, I can't remember the exact percentage, but I think 98% of people are responders. It's high 90s, so you more than likely will respond. Obviously, evidence suggests that there is a genetic limit at some stage, which of course not everyone's going to be a Chris Froome, but we can still improve after that. We can get the VO2 max up, and then we can improve our lactate threshold, etc. On the right here, we see VO2 max for an untrained individual. Obviously, plateaus quite early, whereas a trained individual can get a higher VO2 max there, and there's ways that we can do that. Before I go into the specifics about what sort of training we can do, let's just have a look at some types of aerobic performance and the factors which contribute to that performance. So this is aerobic performances 3 to 20 minutes. VO2 max is a high focus for this because it's such a short event. VO2 max is made up of maximal cardiac output. Cardiac output is how much blood we're circulating each minute. And this is determined by heart rate max, so what your max heart rate is or what your heart rate is currently, times by stroke volume. So stroke volume is how much blood you're ejecting per beat. So it's how much blood you're ejecting per beat times by what your heart rate is. That's how much blood that you can circulate per minute. Obviously, heart rate max doesn't change much. You know, if anything, it goes down, but it's never going to go to 300, for example. But stroke volume we can change by increasing the size of our heart. As we see here, genetics and training determines stroke volume max there. This is basically what we call the AVO2 difference, or a fraction of expired oxygen. This is just saying, simplistically, it's saying, you know, how much oxygen we are getting in the arterial blood compared to how much is being used by the muscles, and therefore how much we're circulating back out. So this is just saying that VO2 max is made up of how much blood that we can circulate and also how much oxygen that we can get out of that blood. Fraction of expired oxygen is obviously determined by fiber type as well. Slow twitch is a better for endurance performance. We're going to go through that in a few weeks' time, which is made up of genetics and a lot of mitochondria and capillary density, which we can, as you can see, change through training. So we really want to focus in, for VO2 max, we want to focus in on the mitochondrial and capillary density and the stroke volume, which we'll go through in a sec. Once we get to longer performances, there's more factors that play a part. Obviously, up here is 21 to 60 minutes. We've still got VO2 max, but now we're taking into account heat load, stress, dehydration, lactate threshold, steady state VO2. Running economy is obviously massive because we want to be able to run faster while using less energy, which comes into biomechanics, bioenergetics, so carbs and fats, etc., which also come as part of fiber type composition. When we go even longer, we're looking at 1 to 4 hours here. Again, VO2 max is still important. However, a lot more factors. We've got heat load, we've got dehydration, we've got liver and muscle glycogen stored. So we need to actually have enough glucose and glycogen to finish a race, which we can obviously change through diet and supplementing during exercise. Again, steady state VO2, lactate threshold, type 1 fibers, running economy, etc. So as you can see, VO2 max is not the be all and end all. We want to get if we can get a high VO2 max, that's one piece of the puzzle, but there's, 8 or 9 or 10 pieces that we need to get correct, especially if we're doing, longer distance stuff. Now, before I go into the lactate threshold, I'll quickly show you this. So there's two types of VO2 max values that we can look at, all right? We've got a relative value and an absolute value, all right? Your relative value is this one here, so measured in milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of body weight per minute. This is your power to weight ratio, all right? So this is a better indicator for sports that are weight bearing or against gravity. So you're looking at things like running, because you have to overcome your body weight each step, and you're looking at things like uphill cycling because you've got gravity pushing you back down the hill. Over here we have your absolute VO2 max. This is measured just in milliliters per minute. It takes out this kilogram component, and this is your absolute power, all right? If you take this number and divide it by your body weight, so this individual was 73.6 kilos, you get this relative value here, all right? So this is a better indicator for things that aren't weight bearing. So you're looking at things like flat cycling, because there's no gravity pushing you down the hill, and your body weight's supported by the wheels. You're looking at things like swimming because you're buoyant in the water, and something like rowing where, again, the water's taking your body weight. Typical example or comparison between the two is that this absolute VO2 max, someone like Fabian Cancellara, best flat time trialist in the world back in his day, he had a massive engine. He was around 7 litres. I think his threshold was 525 watts or something ridiculous. So he had a massive absolute VO2. Right? So that made him well suited to flat time trials because he still weighed 75, 80 kilos. So as soon as you put the weight component into it, and we put him on a hill, his relative VO2 max wasn't as good as someone like Alberto Contador, who weighs 55, 60 kilos. He might not have as big an engine, Contador, but when you divide it by his body weight, he's more suited to the hills. So there's two sort of VO2 max values you can look at. The ways we can change your relative VO2, we can either get fitter, so improve the absolute VO2, or we can drop non-essential weight. So you don't want to lose muscle or power weight, you want to lose fat weight there. We'll jump back into this. So look, nobody can hold 100% of their VO2 max, all right? And we're going to go into lactate threshold next week, but just so you know, obviously no one can hold 100% VO2 max, all right? So not for any longer than about 4 or 5 minutes. So your lactate threshold is the proportion of that VO2 max that you can functionally use for 45 to 60 minutes. So it's when lactic acid entry equals removal. Entry into the muscles equals our ability to remove it. As you can see here, this one is lactate threshold here. The blue one is lactate threshold there. So as soon as we get to that point, we're fine. But then afterwards, you can see that lactic acid entry exceeds our body's ability to remove it. Okay. So average individuals, they hit their threshold at 70% of their VO2 max. The elite guys can hold 88 to 94% of their VO2 max. All right. So most people who are generally fit are somewhere in the middle there, but there's no reason why you can't get to 88 to 94% of whatever your maximum is. But I say we'll go into detail about that at another time. In terms of training to improve your VO2 max, all right, so volume versus intensity. There's a study done by Lawson, I think this one is, and this is basically saying that a combination of both high volume, low intensity training and high intensity interval training is the most important for endurance performance. So we're looking at doing the really easy stuff and the really top end stuff. In terms of typical ratios, the elite guys are about 75% long slow, 10 to 15% high intensity in terms of their volume, and then obviously some recovery in there as well. So it's really important to get both the high volume, low intensity, and also the high intensity interval training. It says here that it's been proven to improve cardiac and skeletal muscle metabolic stuff. So things like mitochondrial oxidative capacity there. So how much oxygen the mitochondria in the muscles can use, improves your fat oxidation, your glucose transport, etc., etc. And this is how it does it. All right. So there's two ways that we can stimulate this PGC1A. Okay, and it doesn't matter what that means, but basically once we stimulate PGC1A, we get an increase in type 1 muscle fibers, which is slow twitch. Again, we'll go through that in a few weeks' time. We get more mitochondria, which I'm going to show you why is so important in a sec. We increase our fat oxidative capacity, and we increase our glycogen stores and our ability to use glucose as well. All right. So one way is doing high volume training, and this is basically repeated contractions at a low intensity, and it needs to be a low intensity. Basically, it's before we start to produce lactic acid above resting, and the reason that is if you remember back to what I said, mitochondria start to shut off when we have lactic acid present. So your long slow distance stuff should be in the absence of lactic acid. We get lots of calcium release into the muscles, calcium or CAMK or calcium monophosphate kinase, doesn't matter. That stimulates this PGC1A, which gives us these adaptations here. The other way we can do it is through high intensity training. And high intensity training, which we'll see in the next slide, is all about hitting 95% velocity at VO2 max or above. What this does is through a completely different pathway, so the adenosine monophosphate kinase, or AMPK down here, that stimulates the same master switch, the same enzyme, which then gives us the same adaptations down the bottom here. Okay, so we can do both high volume, low intensity, and high intensity, low volume. So it's getting rid of that grey zone, as people would say. Cool, let's have a look. So the high intensity stuff, so 95% velocity at VO2 max for several minutes. So more than 2 to 3. So your 2 to 4 is ideal, but you also need to take into account, obviously, training status, age, and exercise mode. So look, if you aren't used to doing high intensity training, it would be unwise to go and do 3 sessions a week. You want to start out by just doing 1. Typical ratios is, look, you only need to accumulate between sort of 12 to 20 minutes of effort time. So, for example, let's go back. Escape. So if we have a look at this person's VO2 max, his velocity at VO2 max was 405 watts. All right. So what I need to do is go 405 watts in the calculator times by 0.95 or 95%. That's 384 or 385 watts. All right. So what this person will need to do is hold 385 watts or above 385 watts for intervals of 2 to 4 minutes. Okay. 2 to 4 minutes, but you get the same rest. There's 2 reasons why we get the same rest. One is because we need to hold 95% velocity at VO2 max, which is pretty significant. That's a high intensity interval there. So we need that to stimulate that AMPK, or that adenosine monophosphate kinase, as we saw before through the high intensity contractions. But we also need the rest to get rid of the lactic acid. All right, we don't want to have lactic acid again. If this is our lactic acid, it comes flooding in because we've got lots and lots of the intensity is super high. But if we do 3 minutes hard and then we have 3 minutes rest or walking rest or easy spinning, depending on what we're doing, we get rid of most of that lactic acid. That means the mitochondria are stimulating, they're growing, they're ready to adapt. Again, lactic acid in, lactic acid out. So a 1-to-1 work to rest ratio. So if you did something like 6 repeats of 3 minutes, that's 18 minutes of effort time, 18 minutes of rest, plus a warm up and a cool down. You're looking at 45 minutes to an hour. Perfect session, all right? So this is what we're seeing here, hit with long intervals. So longer than 2 to 3 minutes, not at or above 95% velocity at VO2 max. Relief duration, it should be a 1-to-1 unless you're doing it should be a 1-to-1 if it's 2 to 4 minute intervals. If you want to have a rest period of longer than 4 minutes, so like 6 minutes, for example, that's when we can start to include jogging, but you're better off just sticking to 2 to 4 on with 2 to 4 off. And you see repeated 6 to 8 by 2 minutes, so never more than 20 minutes of effort time at the top end there. Okay. So yeah, that's hit with long intervals. And I want to show you exactly what that does. Get out of this into paint. All right, so think of mitochondria. Let's say we can breathe in and circulate 100 oxygen molecules. Okay. Pretend that this is in the muscle. These are our mitochondria. All right. So let's say we've got. Apologies for the scrappy drawing. Let's say we've got 5 mitochondria. All right. We've got 5 mitochondria. But we actually have 100 oxygen molecules ready to go. They're ready to go in there, okay? So we breathe in the 100, we circulate that 100, and we get to the muscle, and we've got 5 mitochondria that we can use, all right? The body is a very tightly regulated machine. It's not going to take up more than it can use. So if we have all these little oxygen molecules lining up here, etc., that's not how it works. All right, it's going to take in what it can use. Think of it like a turnstile effect. Think of it like a hotel turnstile. It's a 1-in, 1-out process. You can't fit more than one person through the turnstile at a time at the moment. So they take in the 5 oxygen into the mitochondria. It actually breathes out the other 95 molecules of oxygen. So we take up 5, we breathe out 95. What that's actually showing is this graph here. This is fraction of expired oxygen. In the air at the moment, there's 20, or at sea level, there's 21% oxygen in the air. The other 79% is nitrogen and other stuff that we can't use. So we breathe in 21%. At rest, we breathe out 17%, which would be this line here, which means that our body has used 4%. So 21 in, 17 out, we've used up 4%. So in a VO2 max test or exercise, whatever, if we just sat on the bike or just sat on the treadmill for 20 minutes, your graph would be straight across this 17% mark, all right? But we know that when we start to exercise, our heart rate goes up, our breathing rate goes up, well, our muscles also start to extract more oxygen. The lower the graph, the better, because the lower means that we're breathing less oxygen out, and therefore our body is using up more oxygen inside, all right? So this is all to do with how good our mitochondria are. The bigger, better, stronger mitochondria, the lower this graph goes, therefore the more oxygen that our muscles can use, and that's going to directly affect our VO2 max. So if I go back here, let's say we go do our long, slow, continuous training, again, in the absence of lactic acid or our zone 2 base stuff, or we do our high intensity interval training above 95% VO2 max. What that will do after time to our mitochondria, they're going to increase the number, the size, and the surface area. So let's say we've done 3 months of training. We actually double the amount of mitochondria, and you can see they're a lot bigger than they were before. So because they're bigger, they can actually do two at a time turnstiles here. Upgraded the hotel. So we've got 2 at a time, etc., etc., etc. That's going to mean that we can actually take up 20. If everything else stayed the same, let's say we breathe in 100 molecules, we circulate that 100, we can now take up 20 instead of 5. Therefore, we only breathe out 80. So we've actually taken up, 400% more oxygen. All right. what happens when that happens? This graph shifts right down. This comes closer to 14.5 is elite, etc. 14 is really good. I think a few people get to 13s, which is fantastic. Because we can extract more of the oxygen, and mitochondria are bigger, better, stronger, they can extract more of the oxygen, pushes our VO2 max up, and our heart rate and everything else can go down as well. All right, so that's a really positive adaptation. Because as we see, VO2 max is affected by that one. So this is your fraction of expired oxygen, which we've just improved through increasing our mitochondria. And the other aspect is the stroke volume. So stroke volume is just the size of your heart. So your size of your heart can be, it's a really easy one to train. If you do long, slow distance, it's going to increase the size of it. It's the same thing. If you do the high intensity at 95% above, it's also going to increase the size of it. So you don't have to focus on one or the other. If you just focus on the mitochondria, the heart size will come with it. And that's pretty much it. So this last slide here is just some metabolic adaptations to endurance training as well. So we go off and improve our VO2 max. We actually get a lower RER and muscular respiratory quotient. So what that means is that's the proportion of carbs to fats that we use. So at the same absolute workload, so let's say right now, if I'm cycling at 200 watts, I am using 50-50 carbs to fat. Well, if I go get fitter, so let's say 200 watts was 65% VO2 max, right? So a lot of the research says that at 65% VO2 max, that's when you're using 50-50 anyway. So let's say I'm at 200 watts, I go and get fitter, improve my mitochondria, get a better VO2 max, etc. 65% of my VO2 max is now at 230 watts, all right? So I've gone up. So my 50-50 is now at 230 watts. Therefore, at 200 watts, I can burn more fat, all right? Because it's a lower intensity, so a lower relative intensity. But in terms of absolute workloads, you can actually burn more fat there. Hope that makes sense. As a result, we don't have to use as much glycogen, which is good. We can delay fatigue. Reduced blood glucose utilization in the liver, reduced accumulation of blood lactate because we're fitter. We don't have to rely on that anaerobic system as early. Increased oxidative enzyme activity, yes, because our mitochondria are better, as we know. Increase the oxidation of lipid relative to carbohydrate. Yeah, again, so it's all to do with the carb to fat ratio and a smaller rise in plasma-free fatty acid. So it's good. If you want to become fat adapted, just get fitter. And that's going to cause a lot of controversy, but I'm going to go into detail about why that is the case and get some science to back that up. So that's pretty much it, guys. Hope you enjoyed the first one. Please post your questions below. I might not have covered everything, so if you do have something that needs clarifying, then by all means, let me know. But as a quick summary, to improve your VO2 max, we want to improve your mitochondria and your heart, essentially. And to do that, we want to do long, slow distance training when we're not producing lactic acid, because lactic acid is what inhibits mitochondria. And we want to do high intensity interval training at or above 95% VO2 max for 2 to 4 minutes on with the same rest, because they all stimulate the same thing, and it's all about getting those mitochondria working and that heart increasing in size as well. In terms of how much is right for you, that depends on your training age, your status, your history, your goals, etc. Somewhere around 75% to 15% ratio, with the rest being recovery sounds right. Try to accumulate, work your way up to 2 to 3 VO2 sessions a week. In my opinion, that works very well. A lot of people respond well to that. The rest can be long, slow, easy stuff. Next week, we'll go into some threshold, how to train it, what it is, and how we can tie that into VO2 max to get fitter as well. Thanks, guys. Speak soon.